It was one of those perfect spring afternoons when the sun played hide and seek with fluffy white clouds, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers through Richardson Park. Michelle Anderson, a dedicated middle school teacher in her mid-30s, watched her 6-year-old son Kevin pump his legs back and forth on the swing set, his laughter echoing across the playground. "Hiya, Mom. I want to touch the clouds," Kevin called out, his blonde hair catching the sunlight as he soared through the air. Michelle couldn't help but smile, remembering how far they'd come since the day she first met him at the adoption agency 2 years ago. As she pushed the swing gently, Michelle noticed an older woman in a floral print dress sitting on a nearby bench. The woman, probably in her 70s, kept glancing their way while pretending to read a book. Michelle had seen that look before, the subtle double takes, the confused stares, the whispered conversations. Being a black mother with a white son meant dealing with curious eyes and raised eyebrows, but Michelle had learned to focus on what truly mattered, her son's happiness. Kevin jumped off the swing, landing with the kind of dramatic flair only a 6-year-old could master. "Mom, can we get ice cream after this? Pretty please." He tugged at her sleeve, giving her the puppy dog eyes that usually worked like a charm. "Let's play for a little longer, sweetie," Michelle replied, ruffling his hair. "Then we can talk about ice cream." She watched as he ran toward the jungle gym, his light-up sneakers flashing with each step. The elderly woman, whose pearl necklace and perfectly styled gray hair gave her an air of someone who spent her mornings at country clubs, was now openly staring at them. Michelle caught her pulling out her phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen while keeping a watchful eye on Kevin. A group of kids invited Kevin to join their game of tag, and Michelle's heart swelled as she watched him seamlessly blend in with his new playmates. That's what she loved about children. They didn't see color or differences, they just saw potential friends. But the peace of the moment was shattered when she overheard snippets of the elderly woman's phone conversation. "Yes, I'm at Richardson Park. Suspicious situation. Doesn't look right. The child clearly isn't hers." Michelle's stomach tightened, but she kept her composure. Years of teaching middle school had taught her that losing your cool never helped any situation. Instead, she reached into her tote bag, making sure her folder with Kevin's adoption papers was still there, a habit she'd developed after similar incidents in the past. The woman's voice grew louder. "I think someone should check. Yes, I'll stay and watch. No, the child seems happy, but you never know." Michelle took a deep breath and pulled out her phone, starting to record the interaction discreetly. Not because she wanted to shame anyone, but because experience had taught her the importance of documenting these situations. Kevin ran back to her, his cheeks flushed from playing. "Mom, look what I found." He held up a perfect yellow dandelion, presenting it to her like it was made of gold. "It's for your collection." Michelle had never actually started a dandelion collection, but Kevin had decided months ago that she needed one, and who was she to argue? "It's beautiful, baby." "Thank you," she said, carefully tucking the flower into her shirt pocket. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the elderly woman now standing up, phone still pressed to her ear. The sound of distant sirens made Michelle's heart sink. She knew what was coming, but she refused to let Kevin see her anxiety. Instead, she helped him tie his shoelace that had come undone, all while keeping her voice steady and calm. "Hey buddy, want to show me how high you can climb on the monkey bars?" she asked, knowing it would keep him occupied and happy while she dealt with whatever was about to unfold. As Kevin scrambled toward the monkey bars, Michelle noticed 2 police cars pulling into the parking lot. The elderly woman was already walking toward them, pointing in Michelle's direction. But Michelle stood her ground, head held high, ready to handle whatever came next, not just for herself, but for every parent who'd ever been judged unfairly and for her son, who deserved to play in the park without his family being questioned. The warm spring air suddenly felt heavier as Michelle watched the officers approach. She straightened her back, reminding herself that love doesn't need to match to be real. She was Kevin's mother in all the ways that truly mattered, and no amount of suspicious glances or phone calls could change that fact. 2 police officers walked across the park's grassy area, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Officer Chen was younger, probably in his early 30s, while Officer Rodriguez had streaks of gray in his hair and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen it all. The elderly woman in her floral dress hurried to meet them, her pearl necklace bouncing with each determined step. Michelle kept her eyes on Kevin, who was still happily swinging from the monkey bars, completely oblivious to the situation unfolding. She silently thanked her years of teaching experience for helping her maintain her composure in tense situations like this. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said as they approached, his tone professional but not unkind. "We received a call about a concerning situation in the park. Would you mind speaking with us for a moment?" "Of course, officers," Michelle replied calmly, though her heart was racing. She noticed other parents at the playground starting to pay attention, some pretending to be absorbed in their phones while stealing glances, others openly watching the scene unfold. The elderly woman, who had positioned herself slightly behind the officers, spoke up. "That's her, officers. I've been watching for the past hour, and something just doesn't seem right. The child? Well, you can see for yourselves." Officer Chen pulled out his notepad, his pen hovering over the paper. "Ma'am, could you please tell us your relationship to the child on the monkey bars?" Before Michelle could answer, Kevin's voice rang out across the playground. Mom, look what I can do." He had managed to skip 2 bars at once, a feat he'd been practicing for weeks. "That's amazing, sweetie. Just be careful, okay?" Michelle called back, her voice steady despite the situation. She turned back to the officers. "Kevin is my son. I adopted him 2 years ago when he was 4. The elderly woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with what she probably thought was righteous concern. "But how can we be sure? These days, you hear such horrible stories on the news." Officer Rodriguez held up his hand politely but firmly, quieting the woman's protests. "Ma'am, we'll handle this." He turned back to Michelle. "Do you have any documentation with you?" Michelle nodded, reaching into her tote bag. "I learned early on to always carry copies." She pulled out a folder containing Kevin's adoption papers, her hand slightly shaking as she handed them to Officer Rodriguez. "I have his adoption certificate, my ID, and even pictures from the day the adoption was finalized." As the officers reviewed the documents, Kevin finally noticed the gathering near his mother. His sneakers lit up with each step as he ran over, slightly out of breath from playing. "Mom, who are these people? Are they your friends?" Michelle put her arm around Kevin's shoulders, drawing him close. "These are police officers, honey. They're just doing their job and asking Mommy some questions." Kevin's eyes widened with interest. "Real police officers? Cool. Do you catch bad guys? Do you have a police car? Can I see it?" His innocent enthusiasm cut through the tension like a knife through butter. Officer Chen couldn't help but smile at Kevin's excitement. "We do catch bad guys, buddy. And yes, that's our car over there." He gestured toward the parking lot, then turned to his partner, showing him something in the documents. The elderly woman shifted uncomfortably, her earlier certainty beginning to waver as she watched Kevin snuggle closer to Michelle, clearly comfortable and secure in his mother's presence. Officer Rodriguez handed the documents back to Michelle. "Everything appears to be in order, ma'am. Thank you for your cooperation." He turned to address the elderly woman. "Mrs. Wilson, while we appreciate citizens being vigilant, it's important not to make assumptions. This is clearly a loving mother and son." Kevin tugged at Michelle's sleeve. "Mom, can I show the police officers my new soccer moves?" "Please?" His blue eyes sparkled with excitement, completely unaware of the real reason for their presence. Michelle smiled, running her hand through his blonde hair. "Maybe another time, sweetheart. I'm sure the officers are very busy." Officer Chen knelt down to Kevin's level. "Hey buddy, keep practicing those moves. Maybe we'll see you at the community soccer game next month." "Yes, Mom signed me up." Kevin bounced on his toes. "She's going to be my personal cheerleader. She comes to all my games and practices, even when it's super hot or rainy." The elderly woman's face had turned a deep shade of red. She clutched her handbag tighter, looking like she wanted to disappear into the ground. Officer Rodriguez turned to her with a stern but educational tone. "Mrs. Wilson, would you like to share anything with this family?" The woman's lips trembled as she looked at Michelle and Kevin, really seeing them for the first time, not as a suspicious situation, but as a mother and child enjoying a spring afternoon in the park. The love between them was undeniable, written in every small gesture and interaction. Michelle noticed other parents starting to drift closer, some with supportive smiles, others with their own stories ready to share. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying away some of the tension that had built up over the past few minutes. Kevin, still buzzing with excitement from meeting real police officers, looked up at his mother. "Can we get that ice cream now?" "Pretty please." His question, so innocent and normal, brought everything back into perspective. Michelle hugged him close, breathing in the familiar scent of sunshine and playground dust in his hair. Sometimes the hardest moments led to the most important conversations, and she had a feeling this incident wasn't quite over yet, but maybe, just maybe, it would lead to something unexpected and beautiful. The elderly woman, Mrs. Wilson, stood rooted to her spot, her confidence from earlier now replaced with visible discomfort. The setting sun cast long shadows across the playground, and the evening breeze carried the distant sound of children's laughter from the other side of the park. I don't understand." Mrs. Wilson finally spoke, her voice smaller than before. "I was so sure." She clutched her handbag tighter, knuckles white against the leather strap. Michelle took a deep breath, years of handling difficult parent-teacher conferences coming in handy. "What exactly didn't you understand, Mrs. Wilson? That love doesn't always look the way you expect it to." Kevin, still buzzing with excitement from meeting the police officers, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, can I go play with Tommy and his sister? They're still on the swings." He pointed to two kids waving at him from across the playground. "Stay where I can see you, sweetie," Michelle replied, watching as he ran off, his sneakers lighting up with each bouncing step. She turned back to Mrs. Wilson, who was watching Kevin's easy interaction with the other children. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wilson, would you like to explain what exactly made you suspicious enough to call us?" The woman's pearl necklace clinked softly as she shifted her weight. I saw them arrive at the park, and I noticed they didn't match." She winced at her own words. "I thought maybe, with all the terrible things you hear on the news." "The terrible things." Michelle's voice was gentle but firm, like a mother taking her son to the park on a beautiful spring day, like a child being loved and cared for. A small crowd had gathered nearby, other parents who had been watching the scene unfold. A young mother pushing a stroller stepped forward, her own mixed-race family evident in the sleeping toddler's features. "I've seen Michelle and Kevin here almost every week," the young mother spoke up. "She never misses his soccer practice on the field over there. She's the team's biggest cheerleader, rain or shine." Mrs. Wilson's face flushed deeper. "I didn't mean to. I thought I was helping." She looked at the adoption papers still in Officer Chen's hands, then at Kevin playing happily with his friends. "Do you know what helping looks like, Mrs. Wilson?" Michelle asked, watching her son. "Helping is what my neighbor did when Kevin had the flu last month. She brought us homemade soup and stayed with him so I could pick up his medicine. Helping is what Kevin's teacher did when she noticed he was struggling to adjust after the adoption. She created a special photo project about different kinds of families." Officer Chen nodded encouragingly, and Michelle continued, her voice steady but emotional. "Helping is what the local adoption support group did when I needed advice about maintaining Kevin's connection to his birth culture. They connected us with other families who shared our story." Kevin's laughter rang out across the playground as he zoomed down the slide. "Mom, did you see that? I went super fast." "I saw that, baby. Be careful up there," Michelle called back, then turned to Mrs. Wilson. "Every day, I help my son navigate a world that sometimes questions whether we belong together. I teach him that family isn't about matching skin colors, it's about matching hearts." Mrs. Wilson's eyes welled up with tears. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, she said quietly. "Things were different back then, but maybe I'm the one who needs to be different now." A paper airplane soared past them, and Kevin came running after it. "Sorry, it got away from me." He scooped up the airplane and looked up at the adults, noticing the tension. With the innocent wisdom that only children possess, he held out his craft to Mrs. Wilson. "Do you want to try? I can show you how to make it fly better." The simple gesture, a child offering friendship without judgment, seemed to break something open in Mrs. Wilson. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I owe you both an apology. I let my old fears and prejudices cloud my judgment. I caused you trouble when you were just being a mother to your son." Michelle felt her own eyes getting misty. This wasn't the first time they'd faced prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last, but something felt different about this moment. There was an opportunity here, not just for anger or hurt, but for growth and understanding. "Mom," Kevin called out again, "can Mrs. Wilson come with us for ice cream? I want to show her my airplane collection at home. I have 7 now." The adults all turned to look at Kevin, his innocent request cutting through the remaining tension like a warm knife through butter. His bright smile and hopeful eyes held no trace of the prejudice that had sparked this confrontation. Michelle looked at Mrs. Wilson, seeing not just the woman who had called the police, but someone who might be ready to learn and change. Sometimes the best teaching moments came from the most unexpected situations. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a beautiful backdrop to what had started as an ugly situation. Officer Rodriguez smiled, tucking his notepad away. "I think we're done here, unless anyone needs anything else." Mrs. Wilson straightened her shoulders, looked Michelle directly in the eyes, and spoke with genuine remorse. "I need to do better. We all do. Would that ice cream office still be open?" And there it was, a small moment of grace, an opportunity for bridge building rather than burning. Michelle felt Kevin's small hand slip into hers as he bounced excitedly at the prospect of ice cream and a new friend. Sometimes the hardest moments led to the most important conversations, and Michelle had a feeling this was just the beginning of something transformative, not just for Mrs. Wilson, but for their entire community. The local ice cream shop, Sweet Scoops, was just a short walk from the park. The bell above the door chimed as Michelle, Kevin, and Mrs. Wilson stepped inside, followed by Officer Chen, who had decided to join them on his break. The sweet smell of waffle cones and childhood memories filled the air. "Can I get chocolate chip with sprinkles, Mom? Please?" Kevin bounced on his toes near the display case, his earlier playground energy still very much intact. His reflection in the glass showed his wide grin as he pointed at different flavors. "Of course, Tweety," Michelle smiled, then turned to Mrs. Wilson. "Please, let me treat you to a scoop. It's the best ice cream in town." Mrs. Wilson hesitated, her hands fidgeting with her pearl necklace. "I couldn't possibly, after what happened." "I insist," Michelle said firmly. Sometimes the best conversations happen over ice cream. As they settled into a corner booth, Kevin proudly showed off his paper airplane to Officer Chen, who seemed genuinely impressed by the young boy's folding skills. The late afternoon sun streamed through the shop's windows, creating warm patches of light on their table. "You know," Kevin said between bites of his ice cream, chocolate smeared adorably around his mouth, "my first mom and dad used to take me for ice cream too." He said it so naturally, the way children often do with profound truths. Mrs. Wilson's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Michelle gently placed her hand on Kevin's shoulder, knowing what was coming. He didn't talk about his birth parents often, but when he did, it was always with a mix of innocence and deep feeling that touched everyone around him. "They went to heaven when I was little," Kevin continued, swirling his spoon through the melting ice cream. "They were in a big accident, but then I got my new mom, and she learned all about me, even the things I didn't know how to say." Officer Chen leaned forward slightly, his own ice cream forgotten. "What do you mean, buddy?" Kevin's face lit up. "Mom learned how to do everything. Like when I'm sad about my first parents, she has a special photo album we look at together. And she learned how to make my favorite breakfast that my first mom used to make, pancakes with faces made of fruit." Michelle wiped a bit of chocolate from Kevin's chin, her eyes glistening. "It took me 3 tries to get those pancake faces right, remember?" "Yeah, but now they're perfect." Kevin beamed. "And Mom learned special hair stuff too. She went to classes and everything." Mrs. Wilson looked confused. "Classes?" Michelle nodded, grateful for the chance to explain. "When I was going through the adoption process, I joined support groups for transracial adoption. I learned about caring for blonde hair, which is very different from my own. I wanted to make sure I could do all the little things that parents need to know. She's really good at braiding now," Kevin added proudly. "And she knows all about sunscreen because my skin burns easier than hers. She never forgets, even when I do." Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. I had no idea how much thought and love goes into being a family." Michelle finished gently. "It's not always easy. We get stares at the grocery store, People ask if I'm the babysitter. But Kevin and I, we've built our own traditions. We have Family History Sundays, where we honor both his birth parents and our new family story. Kevin nodded enthusiastically. We make two kinds of cookies, chocolate chip like my first mom made, and peanut butter like mom makes. And we look at pictures and tell stories. Speaking of stories, Kevin continued, his ice cream now more soup than solid. Mom reads to me every night. She does all the funny voices, even for the dragon books, and those are hard. Officer Chen chuckled. She sounds like a pretty amazing mom. The best, Kevin declared, then looked thoughtful. Sometimes kids at school ask why we don't match. I tell them we match where it counts, in our hearts. That's what Mom always says. Mrs. Wilson set down her spoon, her butter pecan ice cream barely touched. Your mother is very wise, Kevin. And I was very foolish today. Everyone makes mistakes, Kevin said with the simple wisdom of childhood. That's what Mom tells me when I mess up my math homework. The important thing is learning from them. Michelle squeezed his shoulder gently, proud of how her son had grown into such a compassionate young boy. Kevin's right. We're all learning, all the time, even moms. Especially nosy old ladies who think they know everything, Mrs. Wilson added with a self-deprecating smile, earning a giggle from Kevin. The ice cream shop's bell chimed as new customers entered, and Kevin waved to some friends from his soccer team. The normal, everyday moment struck Mrs. Wilson, how naturally Kevin fit into this community, how clearly he belonged with the mother who had chosen him, learned for him, and loved him unconditionally. Mom, Kevin said, scraping the bottom of his bowl, can't we show Mrs. Wilson my trophy from the science fair? It's right next to the picture of all of us at Adoption Day. Michelle looked at Mrs. Wilson with a questioning glance. The elderly woman's eyes were warm now, the suspicious squint from the park long gone. I'd be honored, Mrs. Wilson said softly, to learn more about your family. As they gathered their things to leave, Officer Chen bid them goodbye with a warm smile. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light as they stepped outside, three people who had started the day as strangers, now connected by understanding and a few scoops of ice cream. The walk to Michelle's house was short, with Kevin skipping ahead and pointing out all his favorite spots along the way. That's where I learned to ride my bike, he announced, pointing to a gentle slope. Mom ran beside me the whole time, even though she was really tired. Mrs. Wilson noticed how the neighbors waved warmly at Michelle and Kevin as they passed. A teenage girl called out, "Hey, Kevin, great job at soccer practice yesterday." The community's easy acceptance of this family made her earlier suspicions feel even more misplaced. As they approached a cheerful yellow house with flower boxes in the windows, Kevin ran up the porch steps. "This is our house. Mom lets me pick the flowers we plant every spring. I chose yellow ones this time because they look happy." Michelle unlocked the door, and Kevin immediately kicked off his shoes, clearly a house rule. Mrs. Wilson followed suit, noting the organized row of children's shoes and adult shoes by the door. Everything about the home spoke of routine, love, and thoughtfulness. "My trophies are in here," Kevin called out, leading them into a cozy living room. One wall was dedicated to family photos, and Mrs. Wilson found herself drawn to them. There was Kevin winning a soccer medal, Michelle and Kevin covered in flour while baking, and in the center, a photo that made her pause. "That's from our adoption day," Michelle explained softly, standing beside her. In the photo, a slightly younger Kevin sat on Michelle's lap in what was clearly a courthouse, both of them beaming at the camera. "It was the happiest day of my life." Kevin pulled Mrs. Wilson's attention to his prize shelf. "Look, this is from the science fair. I did a project about how plants grow. Mom helped me set up the experiments, but I did all the work myself." His chest puffed with pride. Mrs. Wilson bent to examine the trophy, but her eyes caught something else. A carefully crafted timeline on the opposite wall, decorated with children's drawings and photos. "What's this?" she asked. "That's our family story wall," Kevin explained excitedly. "See, it starts with my first mom and dad here." He pointed to a photo of a smiling couple. "And then when they went to heaven, there's the angel I drew. And here's when I met Mom at the adoption center." Michelle watched as Mrs. Wilson studied the timeline, noting how the elderly woman's hands trembled slightly. Each section was carefully labeled and decorated, showing the thought and care that went into helping a young child understand his complex journey. These cards. Mrs. Wilson pointed to some handmade cards pinned to the wall. We make cards for my first parents on their birthdays and on Mother's and Father's Day, Kevin explained matter-of-factly. Mom says it's important to remember and honor them. We take the cards to their special place in the garden. Mrs. Wilson turned to Michelle, her eyes wet. You help him remember them. Even though they're part of who he is, Michelle said simply. I'm not replacing them. I'm adding to his story. Every child deserves to know their whole truth. Kevin had wandered to the bookshelf, pulling out a thick photo album. Want to see my baby pictures? My first parents gave them to the adoption people to keep for me. Mom added more pictures too, so my whole story is in here. As they sat on the comfortable couch, Kevin between them, Mrs. Wilson watched Michelle interact with her son. She noticed the little things. How Michelle anticipated when Kevin needed help turning the heavy pages, how she gently corrected him when he got a date wrong, how she knew the story behind every photo. And here's my first day of kindergarten. Kevin pointed to a recent photo. I was scared, but Mom said being scared is okay as long as you're brave too. She packed my favorite lunch and put a note in it with a funny joke. Your mother thinks of everything, doesn't she? Mrs. Wilson said softly. Kevin nodded enthusiastically. She even learned to cut my hair. She watched lots of videos and practiced on a doll first. The first time was a little crooked, he giggled, but now she's really good. Mrs. Wilson noticed a stack of books on the coffee table, titles about transracial adoption, helping children process grief, and building healthy family bonds. Several were obviously well-worn, their pages marked with sticky notes. Mom reads a lot, Kevin explained, following her gaze. She says good parents never stop learning, just like I never stop learning math. Michelle laughed. That's right, sweetie. Speaking of which, don't you have some math homework to finish before dinner? Oh, Mom, Kevin protested, but he was already closing the photo album. Can Mrs. Wilson come back another day? I want to show her my rock collection too. The simple invitation, so freely given despite the day's earlier events, seemed to hit Mrs. Wilson hard. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I would like that very much, Kevin, if your mother agrees. Michelle smiled warmly. Of course. Maybe you'd like to join us for Sunday dinner sometime? We always make extra. As Kevin headed upstairs to tackle his homework, Mrs. Wilson turned to Michelle. I don't deserve your kindness after what I did today. You're showing that you're willing to learn and change, Michelle replied. That's all any of us can do. Besides, she smiled, Kevin's already decided you're a friend, and he's usually a pretty good judge of character. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the family photos, the carefully crafted timeline, the well-worn parenting books, all pieces of evidence showing how love, not DNA, makes a family. Mrs. Wilson realized she was seeing something beautiful that her prejudices had nearly blinded her to. A mother and son who had chosen each other, who worked every day to build and strengthen their bond, who honored the past while embracing their present. The kitchen was filled with the warm aroma of chocolate chip cookies baking in the oven. Michelle had insisted that Mrs. Wilson stay for a while longer, and now they sat at the kitchen island while Kevin worked on his math homework at the dining room table, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrated. I don't usually bake cookies on weekdays, Michelle explained, checking the timer, but today feels special. Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important conversations. Mrs. Wilson watched as Michelle moved confidently around the kitchen, pulling out cooling racks and checking on Kevin's progress with his homework. You make it all look so natural, she said softly. Being a mother, I mean. Michelle smiled, though her eyes held a hint of remembered challenges. It wasn't always like this. The first few months after the adoption were challenging. Kevin had nightmares. He was grieving. I was learning. We both were. How did you? Mrs. Wilson paused, searching for the right words. How did you know you could do it? The timer beeped, and Michelle pulled out a perfect batch of cookies. The sweet smell drew Kevin's attention from his homework, but one gentle look from his mother sent him back to his multiplication tables with only minimal grumbling. I didn't know, Michelle admitted, placing the cookies on the cooling rack. But I knew I wanted to try. When I first met Kevin at the adoption center, he was sitting in a corner, clutching a worn-out stuffed penguin and reading a book about space. She smiled at the memory. He looked up at me and asked if I knew why Saturn's rings were special. Not who are you or will you be my new mom, just straight to Saturn's rings. That's when I knew this little boy was meant to be my son. Did you know about Saturn's rings? Mrs. Wilson asked, genuinely curious. Michelle laughed. Not a clue. But I went home that night and read everything I could find about Saturn. The next time I visited, I was ready for any space question he could throw at me. That's what being a parent is, learning what your child needs and doing everything you can to provide it. Kevin's voice carried from the dining room. Mom, I finished the first page. Can I have a cookie now? Bring your work here so I can check it first, Michelle called back. She turned to Mrs. Wilson. He's clever. He'll try to negotiate for cookies before finishing all his homework if I let him. Mrs. Wilson watched as Kevin bounded over, worksheet in hand. Michelle checked his work carefully, pointing out 2 problems he needed to correct. There was no frustration in her voice, only patience and encouragement. After you fix these, you can have 1 cookie, Michelle said, and then finish the rest of your homework before dinner. Can I take a cookie to my room? Kevin tried, giving his best hopeful smile. Nice try, buddy. You know the rule about food upstairs, Michelle replied, ruffling his hair. Besides, crumbs in bed attract cookie monsters. Kevin giggled, clearly familiar with this joke, and headed back to fix his math problems. You mentioned support groups earlier, Mrs. Wilson said once Kevin was out of earshot. Would you tell me more about that? Michelle pulled up a stool and sat down, her face thoughtful. When I decided to adopt, I knew I needed to educate myself. I joined groups for transracial adoptive families, took classes on cultural sensitivity, learned about hair care and skin care for children different from me. But the most important thing I learned was about identity. She gestured to the family timeline visible in the living room. Kevin needs to know his whole story. He needs to see examples of all kinds of families to know that love doesn't have to match to be real. The support groups helped me understand how to give him that. The sound of pencil on paper drifted from the dining room, accompanied by Kevin's quiet counting. Mrs. Wilson watched him for a moment, then turned back to Michelle. I've lived in this neighborhood for 4 decades, she said quietly. I've seen families come and go, but I realized today that I've been seeing without really looking, understanding without really knowing. Michelle nodded encouragingly, sliding a warm cookie across the counter to Mrs. Wilson. There's a community center where I volunteer, Mrs. Wilson continued, breaking the cookie into small pieces. We have a program for seniors to read to children after school. Would you and Kevin be interested in coming? Maybe you could both share your story. The hope in Mrs. Wilson's voice was unmistakable. Hope for understanding, for making amends, for building something positive from the day's earlier conflict. Mom, Kevin called out. I fixed the problems. Can you check them again? Be right there, sweetie, Michelle called back. She turned to Mrs. Wilson with a warm smile. I think sharing our story at the community center would be wonderful. After all, sometimes the best way to change minds is to open hearts first. As they watched Kevin proudly bring his corrected math homework to the kitchen, Mrs. Wilson realized she was seeing something she'd missed before, not just a mother and child who looked different from each other, but a family that had chosen each other, learned for each other, and grown together through love, understanding, and patience. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the kitchen windows, but the warmth inside had nothing to do with the weather. It was the warmth of bridges being built, of understanding growing like the flowers in Kevin's garden, of hearts opening to new ways of seeing family and love. 3 months had passed since that eventful day at the park. The community center buzzed with excitement as families filed into the large meeting room for the monthly Family Stories event, a program that had grown from a simple idea into something truly special. Mrs. Wilson stood at the entrance, greeting people with a warmth that had become her trademark. She wore a bright floral dress and her signature pearl necklace, but gone was the judgmental squint that had once been her default expression. Instead, her eyes crinkled with genuine joy as she welcomed each family. Grammy Wilson. Kevin's voice rang out as he burst through the doors, Michelle following close behind with a tray of her now famous chocolate chip cookies. Over the past months, Mrs. Wilson had somehow transformed from that lady at the park into Granny Wilson, a change that still brought tears to her eyes when she thought about it. "There's my favorite space expert." Mrs. Wilson opened her arms for a hug. "Are you ready to help me with story time today?" Kevin nodded enthusiastically. "I brought my new book about different kinds of families. Mom helped me practice the big words." The meeting room had been transformed with colorful posters showing all types of families: adoptive families, mixed-race families, single-parent families, grandparent-led families, and more. Many of the photos featured local community members who had shared their stories over the past months. "Look, Mom," Kevin pointed to their family photo on one of the displays. "That's from the day we planted the friendship garden with Grammy Wilson." The photo showed the three of them, covered in dirt but beaming, as they planted flowers in the community center's new garden. Michelle smiled, remembering that day. What had started as Mrs. Wilson's simple suggestion to share their story had blossomed into regular community events celebrating diversity in all its forms. The Friendship Garden had been Kevin's idea, a place where families could plant flowers together, symbolizing how beauty comes in many different colors and shapes. Mrs. Chen brought her famous dumplings again, Michelle noted, arranging her cookies on the refreshment table beside a variety of dishes that represented the community's diverse cultures. And look, Mr. Rodriguez made his grandmother's empanadas. The room filled quickly with families of all kinds. Officer Chen, who had been there that day at the park, now regularly attended with his own family. He had become an advocate for community policing programs that emphasized understanding and connection over suspicion. "Everyone, please find your seats," Mrs. Wilson called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her true calling. "Today, we have a special treat. Kevin and his mom are going to read us their new book." Kevin bounced to the front of the room, clutching a handmade book titled Love Makes a Family. He and Michelle had worked on it together, filling it with drawings and photos and simple truths that only a child could express so perfectly. "This is a story about my family," Kevin began, his voice clear and confident. "It's about my first mom and dad who loved me so much they picked out my name. It's about my mom now, who loves me so much she learned everything about me. And it's about Grammy Wilson, who learned that love doesn't have to match to be real." Mrs. Wilson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Kevin continued reading. Around the room, other families listened intently, many nodding in recognition of their own experiences. After the reading, during the refreshment time, new families approached Michelle and Kevin to share their stories. A grandmother raising her grandchildren asked about support groups. A single father wanted advice about adoption. A teenage girl thanked Kevin for helping her understand her own adopted brother better. "You've started quite a movement here," Officer Chen said to Mrs. Wilson, watching the interactions. "Who would have thought that one misunderstanding at the park could lead to all this?" Mrs. Wilson smiled, watching Kevin show a younger child his spacebook. "Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. I thought I was protecting the community that day, but really, I needed the community to teach me." Michelle joined them, carrying fresh cups of lemonade. "The real change happened because you were willing to learn and then share that learning with others. Not everyone would have had that courage." Speaking of sharing, Mrs. Wilson brightened. "Wait until you hear about the new program the community center is starting. We're going to offer free classes for adoptive parents, everything from hair care to cultural celebration ideas. And we're partnering with the library for a special story time featuring diverse family books." Kevin ran up to them, excitement radiating from his face. "Mom, Granny Wilson, can we show them the surprise now?" Michelle checked her watch and nodded. Together, they led the group outside to the Friendship Garden. There, newly installed, was a beautiful bench with a plaque that read, "Love Grows Here," dedicated to all families who choose each other. "The kids helped design it," Mrs. Wilson explained proudly. "Every family who shares their story here gets to plant a flower in the garden." Kevin thought of that. As the families gathered around the bench, taking photos and admiring the flourishing garden, Michelle felt Kevin slip his hand into hers. "We did good, didn't we, Mom?" he whispered. Michelle squeezed his hand, watching Mrs. Wilson show a newcomer the different flowers and their meanings. "We did, baby, we really did." The setting sun painted the sky in beautiful colors, much like that day 3 months ago. But now, instead of tension and misunderstanding, the air was filled with laughter, acceptance, and the chatter of families sharing their stories. A simple walk in the park had transformed into a movement of understanding, proving that sometimes the best endings come from difficult beginnings, and that love in all its forms only grows stronger when shared.